In about 1875, the best estimate is that there were something between 16 and 18 million Jews in the world. Fully a third of them lived in lands controlled under Russia and the Tsar. Basically, that would include today's Poland, all the Baltic states, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, and of course all of Russia. That's a huge part of the world. About 4 million Jews lived in this area. The area was called the Pale of Settlement. Now, pale doesn't mean that it was lacking color or that it paled by comparison. Pale is another word for palisade, which means a fenced-in area. And this was an area where the Tsarist regime had decided that they wanted to concentrate the Jewish population of their territories. So they enforced residence in this area. Conditions worsened year by year. There was extreme overcrowding. Apartments that were intended for a family were used by 3 and 4 families. Poverty was rampant. One estimate says that at least 20 to 25% of all of the Jews of the Pale of Settlement were on food relief, and others were getting other kinds of assistance. Now, of course, conditions in Mother Russia were not particularly good either. The rule of the Tsar was absolutely autocratic. It brooked no dissent. There was no middle class. Either you were in the nobility, and therefore rich, and you owned land, and you had a title, and you had privileges, or you were in the peasantry and the working classes, and you were desperately poor. There was rampant corruption in the government. People got their jobs based on who they were, their lineage, rather than what their skills were. And of course, the results were equally disparate. The military was run by people who just simply did not know what they were doing. And about 25 years later, when Japan and Russia entered into a war in 1904, it became very obvious that the mismanagement of the Russian military was so bad that they were defeated handily by the Japanese. There were major social problems. People were beginning to think in terms of bettering their circumstances and confronting the bad government of the Tsarist regime. The way the Tsarist regime handled this was to blame everything on the Jews. And this, of course, is called scapegoating. They said, it's those folks over there who are taking advantage of you. And they said, maybe you ought to take it out on the Jews. The Russians directed the anger of the people toward this minority group. Now, of course, there was a long legacy of ethnic and religious anti-Semitism in Russia, and the Orthodox Church encouraged this by pointing to the Jews as those who had crucified Christ. Easter Sunday was a day traditionally devoted to prayer on the one hand and attacks on the Jewish community on the other. And there were, of course, economic and social complaints. In 1881 and 1882, things came to a head. Tsar Alexander II was coming home from church with his family one Sunday morning. He rode in his carriage down a street in St. Petersburg, and an anarchist, who was not Jewish, rolled a grenade, sort of a bomb, under the carriage. When it blew up, the Tsar was assassinated. Now, this Tsar, Alexander II, had been a relatively liberal Tsar. Now, that doesn't mean he was liberal by American standards today, but by Russian standards, he was liberal. He had created the Duma, the Russian parliament, and had actually given them some say in forming policy. But the radicals were not satisfied, and so they took out their anger on him and they assassinated him. He was succeeded by his son with the imaginative name of Alexander III. He became the new Tsar, and he was much more conservative and reactionary than his father. He named a particular bureaucrat named Konstantin Podonitsev as the chief curator or procurator of the Holy Synod. Now, this is essentially the interior minister of Russia in charge of police and security. And under his regime, a series of laws were passed in May of 1882, which were called the May Laws, and initiated a period of reaction and suppression of rights. Jews were particularly targeted. Reforms were undermined. Land reform was rejected. Educational opportunities were constricted. Podonitsev's motto was this: orthodoxy, patriotism, autocracy. That's what he stood for. 20,000 Jews were forcibly ejected from Moscow, and in chains they were marched out of the city and into the Pale of Settlement. Of course, what happened? Conditions in the Pale worsened. They got much worse. Quotas were established in education and particularly in universities. And so the opportunity for Jews to rise in any way were restricted. The politics of repression, the politics of a state police, a police state that simply was uncontrolled, continued under a new Tsar named Nicholas II, who ruled from 1894 until the end of the Tsarist regime, 1917. Now, this kind of repression almost automatically provokes change movements. Things had to get better in some way. And so we have the beginnings of a communist movement using the Communist Manifesto that Karl Marx had written in the wake of the 1848 revolts, and Das Kapital, his second work, which came from 1867. These were the Bibles of the new anti-Tsarist movement. And so we have the emergence of both socialism and communism as major movements of objection to the Tsars in Russia. We also have some other movements. We have anarchism, where no law was acceptable. People just did whatever they wanted. And nihilism, which was a movement to destroy the government. Now, for most Russians, change was almost inconceivable. Emigration was not possible, and they were unable to think in terms of going somewhere else. So what did most Russians do? Well, stoic acceptance. This is the way things are. This is what we have to accept. We have no choice. But an increasing impact of Western ideas and the growth of intellectual and student groups of dissatisfied workers and organized radicals meant that change was coming. Jews responded in a somewhat different way. For one thing, they began to abandon Orthodox Judaism as they had been taught and turn to secular intellectualism. Journals, newspapers, books, literature, drama, all began to flourish, and particularly in areas far away from Moscow. The city of Odessa on the Black Sea was considered one of the centers of this kind of intellectual renaissance. There were new radical groups such as the Jewish Communists, Jewish Workers' Party, Jewish Social Labor Party. Some ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic groups resisted by saying, we will wait for the Messiah to come. And the Messiah is certainly going to come faced with this kind of repression. One of the most significant groups that arose in Russia was the Zionists. Now, Zionists are people who center their future hopes on the land of Israel. There was a long religious history for this. After all, Zion or Palestine or Israel or Judea had been part of the biblical heritage of Jews. And every day in the synagogue, there were prayers for its welfare and for a return, both of the Jews and of the Messiah, to the land of Israel. But modern Zionism in Russia became not only religious but political. They used this movement to try to change things. Some sought a homeland in Israel or in Palestine, even though there was no Jewish state. And so beginning in 1882, groups migrated to the area of the Sea of Galilee and elsewhere and began to create kibbutzim, socialist collective settlements. This was a response in part to Russian pogroms. A pogrom is a lightning or thunderstorm of protest against Jews in which the mobs are let loose by government approval for a few days to rampage through the Jewish community, break a few heads, kill a few people, break up Jewish businesses, and then when the government thinks they've done enough, they send in the cavalry and the mob goes home. There had been a significant pogrom in Odessa as early as 1871, but in 1882 and on through the rest of the 19th century, there were pogroms in Odessa, Balta, Rostov-na-Donu, Nikolaevka, Novgorod, and a number of other places. A number of Jews decided that they needed to leave Russia, and they were Zionists. Some of them went into Hakshara movements, preparation movements, where they practiced farming skills that they had never known before, and then they left. Others raised money to support the Yishuv, the settlement in Israel. There were literary expressions of discontent within the Zionist movement. Moses Hess, who died in 1875, was a German philosopher who had helped Marx with the Communist Manifesto. He had witnessed the rise of nationalism and the attendant anti-Semitism that came with it. And he began a philosophy which came to be known as labor Zionism. This was more than just political efforts. He was organizing workers and peasants And in 1862, he wrote a very influential book called Rome and Jerusalem, which proposed a socialist, that is a workers' Jewish state in the land of Israel. Hess had a lot of influence in the lower classes, but no influence in the Jewish literary world or intellectual world equivalent to what he could have had. That came with Judah Leib Pinsker. Pinsker was a doctor. He lived until 1891. He witnessed the pogroms in Poland and in the Ukraine, and especially in Odessa. And he understood that this meant that the future of Jewish life in Tsarist-ruled areas was limited. So he wrote a book called Auto-Emancipation, in which he advocated the creation of a Jewish territory, a Jewish independence, and national consciousness. He wanted to carve out a space in the Russian area that would be Jewish and run by Jews, even if it was not possible to move to Israel. He said, in part, that for the living, the Jew represented a criminal. For the natives, Jews represented foreigners. And so he went on to say that Jews were understood to be beggars, exploiters, people without a country, and most important, rivals who could not be trusted. The most important Zionist leader of the time was a man named Theodor Herzl. And we'll say more about Herzl a little bit later, but briefly at this point, Herzl was born in Vienna. And he was a journalist. He was a secular Jew. He didn't have much use for either Zionism or for Jewish religion. But he turned up in Paris to cover the Dreyfus trial. Now, Alfred Dreyfus had been a captain in the French army and was falsely accused of being a traitor. And he was convicted falsely on the basis of trumped up evidence and sentenced to a life imprisonment in Devil's Island in the Caribbean. Herzl witnessed this travesty of justice, and he converted himself almost overnight to being a Zionist and a fervent advocate for the idea that Jewish people will never have rights as long as they are dependent on the goodwill of their neighbors, because the goodwill just simply didn't exist. He wrote a book called The Jewish State. And the Jewish state said, we must use every political means possible to secure the right of Jewish settlement in the land of Israel. And ultimately, we must convince the world's leaders to allot part of this land to a Jewish state. He spent the rest of his life, until his death, moving around all over the world, meeting with various leaders in Italy and England and Germany, France, trying to see if he couldn't convince them to coalesce behind a movement to create a Jewish state. He did not really succeed, but he made a valiant effort. And his crowning glory was perhaps the first Zionist Congress in 1897, which met in Basel, Switzerland, with hundreds of people in attendance and formulated a platform for political Zionism, which ultimately became the platform for all Zionists who wanted to establish a Jewish state. Now, in the face of this kind of oppression and these kinds of attacks on Jews, there was only one response the Jews could make. Of the 6 million who lived in Eastern Europe in about 1880, about half emigrated and left that area between 1882 and 1924. Most of them came to the United States. The best estimate is that roughly 2.5 million Jews came across the American border during the period of 40 years. Others went to many other destinations. There became significant Jewish communities in South America and Mexico, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and of course in Palestine. Anywhere was better than continuing under the Russian rule of oppression. And so, as we move forward into the post-Civil War era and the modern era, we find Jews moving around the world and creating new realities in a variety of different countries.